Good morning. I hope you all had a restful weekend. I did. It was good out. It was nice outside, especially on Saturday. My husband and I took a bike ride out to the country. And did you know there are peacocks out? There's like this garden, like a greenhouse, and there are peacocks out there. I had no idea. We heard them when we were biking. They sound like help, help. And I'm like, I know that sound. That's a peacock. So when everything, I guess, a little bit less crazy, I might go out to the garden and see what they look like. So it would be fun. Um, we are still on Mother West Wind's Neighbors right now, and we are on chapter 5 called Happy Jack Squirrel's Stolen Nuts. And if you notice, a lot of these stories could actually happen. Maybe not quite in the way that they are told, but with the characters, talking and everything. But could a squirrel actually have his nuts stolen? Yeah. Could a bird actually go bother another bird? Yeah. So they're kind of based on, what animals actually do, but they've given them like human characteristics to make them more of a story. Something was wrong with Happy Jack Squirrel. There was no doubt about it. Something was very wrong indeed with Happy Jack. He was racing up and down the old hollow chestnut tree, now in, now out, now running around and around it, all the time scolding as fast as his tongue could go. His voice grew angrier and angrier, and then all at once he sat down on his doorway, buried his face in his hands, and began to cry. Boo-hoo-hoo, cried Happy Jack Squirrel. Just then, along came Chatterer the red squirrel, who is a cousin to Happy Jack the gray squirrel. Chatterer is a mischief maker. He likes to see other people in trouble. I know some of those people. I'm sure we all know some of those people that just do things to make other people upset or put them into trouble. Not someone I would want to be friends with. Soon, he saw Happy Jack sitting on his doorway crying. He put his hands on his hips, ran his tongue at Happy Jack's, and called out shrilly, "Cry, baby Crispy! His mama's name is Dipsy!" Happy Jack stopped crying. "I'm not a crybaby," he shouted. "I bet you'd cry if someone had stolen all your nuts that you had been hiding away for winter." Chatterer grinned. He does not love his cousin, Happy Jack, and it tickled him immensely to think that someone had stolen Happy Jack's nuts. Happy Jack saw that grin. He glared at Chatterer. Then he said slowly, "I believe that you know where my nuts are." "Perhaps I do, and perhaps I don't," replied Chatterer provokingly. "You're a thief!" cried Happy Jack. "Am not, you are! I'm not, you are!" There they were, facing each other, two little cousins, one in a gray suit, the other in a red, both so angry that they danced up and down. It wasn't pretty to see, nor nice to hear. Suddenly, Happy Jack sprang at Chatterer. "I'll teach you to steal my nuts," he cried. Now, Happy Jack is twice as big as his cousin, Chatterer, and the latter had no idea of fighting. So away he raced out on the very tip of a branch of the old chestnut tree and made a flying leap over into the next tree. And after him ran Happy Jack, crying, "Stop, thief! Stop, thief!" Here they are on the branch, fighting at the top of his lungs. But that was an exciting race through the treetops. But Happy Jack couldn't catch his nimble cousin, who, just to tease him, always kept just out of reach. Finally, they stopped to rest in an old apple tree, under which sat Peter Rabbit and Johnny Chuck. "What's all the fuss about?" asked Peter Rabbit. "He stole my nuts," said Happy Jack, pointing at Chatterer. "No such thing," sputtered Chatterer. Peter Rabbit turned to Johnny Chuck and winked one eye. Then he held up a warning hand. "Listen," said he. Way off, in the green forest, they heard a voice crying, "Thief! Thief! Thief!" It was Sammy Jay's voice. Happy Jack understood then who had stolen his nuts. He held out his hand to Chatterer. "I take it all back," he said. Chatterer grinned. "What will you give me if I find your nuts for you?" he asked. "Half," replied Happy Jack. "Agreed," said Chatterer as he scampered off toward home. He brushed his coat and combed his hair and put on his finest white waistcoat. Then he started along the lone little path that twists and winds through the green forest. Presently he met Bobby Coon. "Good morning, Bobby Coon," said Chatterer with his very best bow. Bobby Coon looked at Chatterer sharply. Then Chatterer said, when Chatterer is polite, he may be pretty sure that he has some favor to ask. Oh, you may be pretty sure that he has some favor to ask. Morning, growled Bobby Coon. Chatterer pretended not to notice Bobby Coon's grumpy manner. They tell me that you are a great traveler and have seen much of the world, Bobby Coon, said he. It must be fine to have seen so much. Now Bobby Coon felt greatly flattered to hear Chatterer say this. He swelled himself out in a very important manner and cleared his throat. Yes, he boasted, there isn't much in the Green Forest or in the Green Meadow that I don't know about. I know where everybody lives and... Oh, Bobby Coon, it can't be that you know where everybody lives. That really can't be, for some folk are just so very clever in hiding their homes, said Chatterer, pretending to be very doubtful. Pooh, said Bobby Coon disdainfully. There is no one as so clever that can hide their house from me. Not even Sammy Jay? Asked Chatterer with an air of great doubt. Ho, 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 laughed Bobby Coon. Why, Sammy Jay lives in the little spruce tree that stands halfway down the hill between the crooked little path and the great pine. This was all Chatterer wanted to know. So he bade Bobby Coon goodbye and started on his way. As soon as Bobby Coon was out of sight, Chatterer hurried over to the young spruce halfway down the hill, and sure enough, there was Sammy Jay's home. Chatterer grinned an unpleasant grin. I think I'll make a call, said he. Kind of a not very nice guy, is he? In a flash, he was up the tree. He had forgotten all his politeness now, for without so much as knocking, he popped his head over the edge of Sammy Jay's nest and frightened Mrs. Jay, so she flew off screaming at the top of her lungs. But in a few minutes she was back, for she had left 4 beautiful eggs, and she knew that Chatterer is very fond of eggs. They are very nice eggs, said Chatterer. Yes, said Mrs. Jay fearfully, of what he might say next. And I'm very hungry, said Chatterer. Mrs. Jay fell to weeping. Of course, I'd rather have nuts, but I think that these will make a very good dinner. Nuts are very scarce at this time of year. Mrs. Jay stopped weeping. Will you leave my eggs alone if I bring you some nuts? She asked. Chatterer agreed, and Mrs. Jay hurried off. As soon as her back was turned, Chatterer stole after her. Now, he said, I shall find out where Happy Jay has stolen. I will find out where Happy Jay's stolen nuts are. Mrs. Jay went directly to the big pine where Blacky the Crow's nest was. Chatterer hid behind a big gray birch and watched. His eyes shone. He was so excited that he could hardly keep his claws from rattling on the bark. Up in the Blacky the Crow's old nest, Mrs. Jay was very, very busy. But every few minutes she would look all around to see if anyone was watching. She did not see Chatterer, and he chuckled to himself. Pretty soon she flew towards home. Chatterer chuckled right out loud. Then, like a flash, he climbed up the big pine to the old nest of Blacky the Crow. And where he found, what do you think? Why, all Happy Jack Squirrel's store of nuts. Chatterer's eyes glistened. His cousin, Happy Jack, had promised him half if he would find and return them. Now he had found them, and half were his. But why not have more than half? Who would know if he did not divide fairly? Just as Mrs. Jay had done, Chatterer looked all around, and no one was in sight. Chatterer began to work very fast. Out of the bottom of the nest he pulled a lot of sticks, until pretty soon down dropped a nut, then another, and another, and another. By and by the last nut had dropped down to the ground. Chatterer scampered down and gathered them into 3 piles instead of 2. When the last nut had been picked up, he took all that were in 1 pile and hid them in a big hollow log lying near. Then he hurried off to find his cousin, Happy Jack, and showed him the 2 piles of nuts. So he's hiding that 3rd pile away for himself. What a stinker. Oh dear, how will we ever get all these nuts over to my hollow chestnut tree? Wailed Happy Jack. You see, he was a long way over to the hollow chestnut tree, and Happy Jack could carry but 2 nuts at a time. Chatterer winked one of his small bright eyes. Then he whispered in one of Happy Jack's ears, and Happy Jack was so tickled that he shouted aloud. Off the 2 started to the Green Meadows. There they found the Merry Little Breezes, and soon had them racing over to the Green Meadows and through the forest with invitations to a nut race that afternoon. Of course, no one would miss such a jolly affair as that, and early in the afternoon all the little meadow people and all the little forest folk had gathered by the 2 piles of nuts. That is, all were there but Sammy Jay. You see, Sammy's conscience troubled him, for you remember that he was the thief who stole the nuts in the first place. When all were ready, Chatterer gave the word to start, and then everyone took as many nuts as he could carry and hurried over to Happy Jack's storehouse. Back and forth they scurried. Even Spotty the Turtle entered the race, although he moved so slowly it took him all the afternoon to carry one nut. When Happy Jack's pile had disappeared, they took Chatterer's over to his storehouse. And all the time, Chatterer pretended to be very busy himself, but really wasn't doing a lot of anything. I know people like that too. That when work has to be done, they somehow don't seem to be around. Kind of annoying. It was very exciting indeed. And who do you think won? Why, Peter Rabbit, because his legs are long and meant for hurrying. When the last one had gone, Chatterer brushed his clothes, and then, with a crafty smile, he stole over to the hollow log where he had hidden the third pile of nuts. He was thinking how smart he had been. It didn't trouble him a bit that he had been dishonest. He peeped into the hollow, and then he rubbed his eyes. The nuts were not there. Chatterer sat on the end of the hollow log and scratched his head. With his sharp little eyes, he looked this way and looked that way. The more he looked, the less he saw. This certainly was the very hollow log that which he had hidden the third of the nuts that really belonged to his cousin, Happy Jack. Once more he crept into the hollow and searched. Not a nut to be found. It was very strange. Then Chatterer did a very foolish thing. He lost his temper. Yes, sir, Chatterer lost his temper. He rushed out of the hollow log and worked himself into such a rage that he made the leaves fly in every direction, and all the time he scolded as fast as his tongue could go. "Hello! What's going on here?" said a voice. Chatterer stopped long enough to glare at the speaker. It was Bobby Coon. "Nothing's the matter," snapped Chatterer. Bobby Coon grinned. "Seems to me you make a terrible fuss over nothing," said he. "If I didn't know, I should think you had lost something." Bobby Coon grinned again in the most provoking way and began to comb his whiskers. Chatterer looked at him. Could it be that Bobby Coon knew what had become of those nuts? But Chatterer did not dare ask any questions, because you see he had stolen those nuts, and it wouldn't do to say a word about them. So he just snapped crossly, "There's nothing the matter, and it's none of your business anyway." "All right," said Bobby Coon good-naturedly. 7:40. As he stretched lazily, "I guess I'll be going along." So, and it says at the end here, "Folks who lose their tempers so and all for nothing get so mad." I guess that's supposed to be the moral of the story. Oh, no, it's not quite done yet. "Folks who lose their tempers so and all for nothing get so mad are best left quite alone, you know. It's really, I think, too bad." Oh, I think Bobby Coon is saying that. Bobby Coon went on down the lone little path, chuckling to himself, while Chatterer, crosser than ever, started anew to look for the missing nuts. Hardly had he begun when he heard another voice. "I love to see folks rush about, so full of business all day long. So be their work, be honest work. They'll soon make right of every wrong." It was Jimmy Skunk, and he was talking to himself as he ambled down the lone little path, just as if he didn't see Chatterer at all. Chatterer scowled as he watched Jimmy Skunk out of sight. Could it be that Jimmy knew anything about all those nuts? Chatterer was growing very uncomfortable. He would go home and wait till tomorrow before looking any more. Chatterer's conscience was troubling him, and a troublesome conscience is a very uncomfortable thing. Like when you do something wrong and you know it, and you're worried about getting into trouble. No sooner was he out of sight than Striped Chipmunk popped out of the hole close by the old hollow log and began the wildest dance ever seen. While his fat little sides shook with glee, you see, he had seen Chatterer hide the nuts. Oh, here's a picture of... This might be Jimmy Skunk? No, this is probably Bobby Coon walking by. It says, you see, he had seen Chatterer hide the nuts, and he knew that they were stolen. So while Chatterer had been planning the nut race, Striped Chipmunk had removed all the nuts to his own snug little storehouse, and tomorrow he would take them back to his big cousin, Happy Jack. The world is very full of eyes. They're in each rock and tree. Whate'er you do, be very sure someone is bound to see. So sang Striped Chipmunk as he danced around the old hollow log. That's a good story. Moral of the story, don't try to steal because someone's going to find out. And even if you didn't, your conscience would get the better of you. Just think about it. Happy Jack would not have gotten all his nuts that he was supposed to have if Chatterer had stolen all of them. All right, the next one is why Sammy Jay cries thief. Ooh, I like this story. Okay. Thief, thief, thief! Such a harsh voice, and such an unpleasant thing to be screaming on a beautiful sunshiny morning. Johnny Chuck and Peter Rabbit looked up among the blossoms of the old apple tree. It seemed as if a bit of the sky itself was right there, in the midst of the pink and the white flowers. It was Sammy Jay. His blue coat with white trimmings never looked handsomer, and the smart cap he always wears over his head looked smarter. Yes, indeed, Sammy Jay was always very beautiful to look at. Johnny Chuck thought so. What a handsome fellow Sammy Jay is, he exclaimed admiringly. Sammy Jay heard him and began to strut proudly and show off his fine coat. Handsome is as handsome does, said Peter Rabbit. You heard what he was screaming? Yes, said Johnny Chuck. I heard, but whom was he calling a thief? Peter Rabbit turned and stared at Johnny Chuck, as if he thought Johnny didn't know much. Then he looked up at Sammy Jay. Tell Johnny Chuck what your name is, he called. Now Sammy Jay doesn't like Peter Rabbit, and he flew into a rage at once. He leaned down and screamed at Peter at the top of his lungs, but all he could say was, Thief! 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 Peter grinned as he turned to Johnny Chuck. When he screams, Thief! He's just telling all the world what he is himself, said Peter. He's the worst thief in the Green Meadows, or in the Green Forest. If you've got anything you really want to keep, don't let Sammy Jay see it. But what does he tell everybody that he's a thief for? Johnny Chuck asked. He has to. Old Mother Nature makes him. I guess he can't help stealing. It runs in the family. His father was a thief, and his grandfather was a thief, and his great-great-grandfather were all the way back to the days when the world was young, where they were thieves, replied Peter Rabbit. Just then, Sammy Jay flew away screaming, Thief! At the top of his lungs. I wonder what mischief he's up to now. If there's any trouble anywhere in the Green Meadow or in the Green Forest that Sammy Jay isn't at the bottom of or doesn't know about, it's because Sammy was asleep when it happened. That's funny. I know people like that too. Sammy Jay is mighty fine to look at. Oh, 7:45, time for school to start. But the fine clothes never yet made a gentleman, said Peter. What does that mean? Fine clothes never made a gentleman. It means that really it matters inside who you are, not so much what you're wearing. But how did Old Mother Nature happen to make him tell everybody that what he really is? Inquired Johnny Chuck. Peter Rabbit yawned. It's a long story, said he. Someday you can go down, excuse me, I'm tired too, to the Smiling Pool and ask Grandfather Frog to tell you all about it. He knows, for he told me. Now, I must get back to the dear old briar patch for my morning nap. Goodbye, Johnny Chuck. Goodbye, Peter Rabbit, replied Johnny Chuck. After Peter had left him for the dear old briar patch, Johnny sat in his doorstep under the old apple tree a long time thinking of what Peter had told him about Sammy Jay. What a dreadful thing for someone who is so handsome to be a thief, and how very, very dreadful to have to tell everybody, said Johnny Chuck. I believe I'll go over to the Smiling Pool right now and ask Grandfather Frog about it. So Johnny Chuck brushed his clothes until he looked spick and span. Then he trotted down the lone little path across the Green Meadows to the Smiling Pool. There, just as he expected, he found Grandfather Frog sitting on his own special big green lily pad. Now, Johnny Chuck is rather a favorite of Grandfather Frog's, so when Johnny politely asked for the story of how it happens that Sammy Jay goes about crying, Thief! Grandfather Frog was very willing to tell him. Chug-a-rum, began Grandfather Frog in a very deep voice. Chug-a-rum, it was this way. A long, long time ago, a very long, long time ago, when the world was young, things were very different from what they are now. Excuse me. I don't know why I'm yawning so much. Oh my, yes, very different indeed. Everybody loved everybody else. At least everybody was supposed to love everybody else. Nobody was afraid of anyone. All the animals and all the birds lived like one great happy family. Grandfather Frog sighed, and in his great googly eyes, Johnny Chuck could see a dreamy look, as if he really could see those happy, long ago days when the world was young. Johnny waited patiently And by, Grandfather Frog began again. Here's a picture of Grandfather Frog. Let's see. Old Mother Nature had given old Mr. Jay, the grandfather 1,000 times removed of Sammy Jay, one of the handsomest coats of all the birds. It was just as if she had taken a little bit of the sky when it was bluest and trimmed it with little bits of the clouds when they were whitest. Just like Sammy Jay's beautiful coat now, interrupted Johnny Chuck. Just like Sammy Jay's beautiful coat now, said Grandfather Frog. At first, old Mr. Jay, who wasn't old then, you know, but young and smart, didn't think anything about his handsome coat. After a while, though, he noticed that whenever he came around, all the other animals and birds would stop whatever they were doing to admire his handsome coat. Pretty soon, he began to admire it himself. The more he looked at it, the more he admired it. The more he admired himself, the more he wanted others to admire it. Whenever anyone came near, he would strut back and forth so as to show off his handsome coat. Now, from admiring his clothes, Mr. Jay got to admiring himself. He began to think that because Old Mother Nature had given him handsomer clothes than his neighbors had, he was a little bit better than they were. Then he began to look down on everyone who wasn't finely dressed. Yes, sir, that was just the way Mr. Jay began to feel and act. Chug-a-rum! Just as if his fine clothes could make anyone better. Just as if fine clothes could make anyone better than anyone else. Grandfather Frog spoke with the greatest scorn. So Mr. Jay began to hold his head very high, continued Grandfather Frog. He held it so high that when he met some of his neighbors who wore plain clothes, he didn't see them at all. At first they didn't mind. They just laughed at him. But by and by they noticed that whenever Mr. Jay met any of his neighbors who wore fine clothes, such as Mr. Redbird, Mr. Tanager, Mr. Oriole, these are all different birds, he always saw them and made them a very grand bow. Then these plain neighbors of Mr. Jay grew angry when he passed them with his head held so high and strutting so proudly to show off his beautiful and white and blue coat. After a little while, they just wouldn't have anything to do with him, but made fun of him whenever he passed. But Mr. Jay didn't seem to mind. No, sir, he didn't seem to mind, not in the least bit. You see, he thought himself so far above these plain neighbors that he didn't care what they thought. Now, you know, fine clothes need a great deal of care, and here is Mr. Jay. See, the author put kind of like a coat on him. Let's see. So Mr. Jay began to spend more and more time taking care of his fine coat. Indeed, he spent so much time taking care of it and thinking about it and showing it off that he did very little else. He didn't have time to work on his daily living. Besides, work would be apt to spoil his fine coat. Work was for those who wore plain clothes. If they got them soiled, it wouldn't matter. But Mr. Jay had got to eat, even if he couldn't work. So what do you think he did? Why, he began to steal from his neighbors. Yes, sir, Mr. Jay began to steal. He was very sly about it, was Mr. Jay, so no one suspected him. He stole what he wanted to eat and spent the rest of his time taking care and showing off his fine clothes. I forgot to tell you that with this beautiful coat and white coat, Mr. Jay had a beautiful voice, one of the most beautiful voices among all the birds. He was almost as proud of his beautiful voice as he was of his coat. Even those who turned their backs on him because of his airs used to stop and listen when Mr. Jay sang. And this made Mr. Jay still even more vain. Vain means you care a lot about how you look and how you are, how you look as on the outside. So he went straight on, stealing from his neighbors and pretending to try to make himself believe that he had a right to take from his neighbors in return for the privilege of looking at his fine coat and listening to his beautiful voice. Now, the habit of stealing is like all other bad habits. It grows and it grows and it grows. And after a while, Mr. Jay stole just for the fun of stealing. He stole more than he possibly could eat and used to hide it away in all sorts of places. Whenever he found the storehouse of one of his neighbors, he would watch until he was sure that no one was looking. Then he would pick out the very best things in it, for nothing but the best was good enough for such a fine gentleman as he thought. And he couldn't eat what he wouldn't What he couldn't eat, he would take to his own storehouse. Of course, all the stealing couldn't go on without being found out. Mr. Jay's neighbors began to suspect each other. No one dreamed of suspecting Mr. Jay. He was far too fine a gentleman to do anything like that. So they suspected each other, and matters grew from bad to worse until... Sorry, guys. Until there was a terrible fuss among the animals and birds. Mr. Jay used to listen with his head to one side and chuckle to himself. He grew bolder and bolder, but he always took great care to cover up his tracks. Oh, he was sly, Mr. Jay. Now, such a terrible state of affairs couldn't go on without reaching the ears of Old Mother Nature. One fine morning she appeared quite unexpectedly and called together all the animals and birds to tell her what the trouble was. My, how they did crowd around her, all talking at once, each accusing his neighbors of stealing from him. Only Mr. Jay had no complaint to make. He strutted up and strutted down to show Old Mother Nature what good care he had taken of his fine suit. But he didn't have a word of complaint of anyone breaking into his storehouse. Old Mother Nature noticed this, and it didn't take her 2 minutes to guess who the thief was, for you can't fool Old Mother Nature, and it's of no use to try. She listened to all the complaints, then she made all the animals and birds sit down around her in a great big circle. She told them how grieved she was that such a terrible thing should ever have happened, and how glad she was that she had come, for she had found the thief. When she said this, Mr. Jay gave a guilty start, but Old Mother Nature didn't look once at him, and then he chuckled to himself and wondered whom she would accuse, and he chuckled more as he saw the black looks of his neighbors were giving each other. Then Old Mother Nature went on to say that she would punish the thief so that he never would forget it, and that none of his neighbors would ever forget it. Before I do this, Old Mother Nature said, I'm going to ask Mr. Jay to sing for us. Of course, Mr. Jay was prouder than ever to have Old Mother Nature pay him such attention. He flew up to the top of the tallest tree where everybody could see and admire his beautiful coat. He turned around 2 or 3 times as if trying to get a comfortable perch, but really to show himself off. And then he opened his mouth to sing. What do you think happened? Instead of the beautiful song that everybody expected and it was waiting for, there came from Mr. Jay's throat only a harsh, unpleasant scream. And what he said was, "Thief! Thief! Thief!" Of course, everybody knew who the thief was. Mr. Jay hid himself in the deepest, darkest part of the forest and hoped that the others would forget. But they never did. They couldn't have if they had tried, because forever after, whenever Mr. Jay tried to speak, he screamed, "Thief!" Old Mother Nature allowed him to keep his beautiful suit and pass it down to his children and his children's children, but ever since that long day ago, when the world was young, the Jays have had to tell the world what they really are. And now you know why that is that Sammy Jay cries, "Thief! Thief! Thief!" It is because his fine coat covers a black heart, concluded Grandfather Frog. That's a good story. It's got a really good moral behind it. That looks don't make everything. It's better to be a good person. All right, we will see you tomorrow. I hope that you guys all received the Flat Math Fairies and Flat Math Pirates and are having adventures with them today. And I look forward to seeing pictures of what you guys are doing and writing about. So I'll let you guys go. Have a good day, guys. I miss you.